Is the world barreling toward hyperinflation? Ultimately, the Bible says yes, and when you read today's headlines, it becomes abundantly clear hyperinflation is in the not too distant future. Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Today, we're going to talk about is hyperinflation in our near future. Now, what does all this mean? Ultimately, inflation, hyperinflation are terms that apply to the currency supply, but as we use them today, mostly when people talk about inflation, they mean rising prices, and we've definitely seen rising prices globally for the last year and a half. Why is that? Well, the politicians that powers that be like to give us a number of explanations that push the blame away from them, right? But they'll say, well, it's because of the pandemic, it's because of the supply chain, or it's because of Vladimir Putin. They're always pushing the blame away, but we're going to look at exactly why we're seeing the inflation now we've seen, and it has really very little to do with those things. I'm not saying those things didn't have an impact, but ultimately, again, inflation is a result of the currency supply. So let's take a look at this chart. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And what we're looking at here is their measure of M1. They call it money supply. I would call it currency supply. But what is this? Well, it's basically cash and deposits at banks. So checking accounts, savings accounts, demand deposits. So what do people have in their checking accounts, right? That's essentially what they're measuring here to make it very simplified. And what do we see on this graph? We see, well, things are, steadily rising over the years and over the years and over the years. And then all of a sudden they spike upward. And they've just been going nothing but up until about 6 months ago, and now we're seeing just a little bit of leveling off here. But where did all this currency come from? Is this because the spike over here, the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened about right up here, when the thing peaked. Didn't happen all the way back here. So what happened? Well, we all know what happened 2.5 years ago globally. What was the government reaction to that? Well, this indicates what the United States government reaction was. Think about what was done at that time. So for your average person, they saw the CDC implement a rent moratorium, meaning you didn't have to pay your rent and the landlord couldn't kick you out. Well, for most people, their rent or their mortgage is their number one expense. So if all of a sudden you don't have to pay it, and you don't have to worry about losing shelter as a result of that, well, your bank account is probably going to increase as a result of that. We saw the same thing to a lesser degree with mortgages and deferment of mortgage payments. We saw deferment of student loans. A lot of that is still ongoing to this day. We said, oh, well, we've got this national emergency. People shouldn't have to pay their student loans, right? So think if you don't have to pay your student loans, you're probably going to have more money in your bank account. Think about these stimulus checks that were sent out. We have an emergency. We need to send everybody checks for $2,000. Think about these, all these different programs like PPP loans that turned out not to be loans at all. They were just forgiven, and businesses were given large lump sums of cash that they used for who knows what. We saw a rise in child tax credits, which really weren't, for most people, tax credits. They were just really welfare payments because there was no tax paid to be credited in a lot of cases. And then those were taken from when they would have been received typically in the spring of 2022. They were moved forward, and half of that credit was handed out in the latter 6 months of 2021. So we have all this currency being printed by the government. They call it borrow, but they're simply printing it. And they're handing that out to people people who would put this in their bank accounts and then go out and do what with it? Spend with it. So when we see this level of increase in US dollars and currency in demand deposit accounts, but we haven't seen a corresponding increase in the number of goods and services available to the public, Economics 101 tells us that it will take more of these currency units to purchase the same things you purchased in the past. Meaning, not that the price of items is going up. The price of goods and services, that nominal price may be going up, but it's really a reflection of the currency losing its purchasing power, rather than a reflection of the value of those items, the price of those items going up. Now, again, there are some cases where this isn't the case, where you've had less oil or less food being produced as a result of various supply chain issues, energy shortages, etc. But for the most part, it's this currency creation that has created this inflation. So, will it get any better? We are seeing this sort of make a little bit of a downturn here, so maybe there's hope. Well, it probably isn't going to get any better, and this is why. We're going to go. We've talked in the past about what would the politicians do when people are faced with mounting bills for any number of things, whether it's to pay their rent or to pay for food and fuel, especially because people get desperate when they can't get the necessities of life. And what would the politicians do? Well, they'll promise to print currency and hand it out to people on a permanent basis, much like we saw over the last couple of years. So if there's any doubt about that will happen, this article should clear that up. This is from Newsweek. It says, majority of Americans back new stimulus checks to combat inflation. So you can't make this stuff up. So the very thing that has caused the inflation we're seeing is what people are demanding more of. So they want more of the same thing, and they expect a different result. It says here, a majority of Americans support the idea of new stimulus checks to combat inflation, according to a poll conducted exclusively for Newsweek. The survey found 63% of respondents said they agree, with 42% saying they strongly agree when asked if the federal government should issue new stimulus checks to tackle inflation. So, it's not going to tackle inflation, it's going to make it worse, but surprise, people would like currency to be given to them, having done nothing, having produced nothing, or providing nothing. They want it to be given to them. Who would have thought? So, it says 18% of respondents disagreed, while 15% said they neither agree nor disagree, and 3% said they do not know in response to the question. So let's think about those numbers for a second here. So you got a politician who's given 63% of the people want that politician to issue more currency and hand it to them. And only 18% say no. So what do you think? Leave your answer in the comments below. Do you think politicians will find that appealing and say, maybe I can buy votes among these? I can get 63% of the people to vote for me if I hand them new currency, if I send them checks for their groceries, for their rent, for fuel, and I'll say that we're combating inflation by sending them these checks, and I'll be a hero and I'll win re-election. Or I could say no and agree with the 18%, which would really be combating inflation. Which avenue, which road do you think those politicians will choose? I think it's very clear, and we've said for quite some time on this channel, that this is what would happen, is you would see the price of groceries rise. People would say, I can't afford my grocery bills. And then the politicians would say, every person needs $1,000 a month for grocery payments. We need to send everybody $1,000 a month for groceries. And then when you do that, You increase demand for groceries, supply stays the same. And in the world we're in right now, that supply is actually dropping. So the price is going to go up. And then they'll say, well, now people really can't afford groceries. This inflation is out of control. We need to send everybody $2,000 a month. And then it'll become $4,000, $8,000, $16,000, on and on and on. And you get hyperinflation. And if there's any doubt that this is where the road the politicians are choosing, just take a look at this article. This says stimulus checks could be coming to these 4 states soon. The last federal stimulus checks went out in 2021, but individual states are starting to come through with financial help for residents as record inflation continues to affect many Americans' bottom lines and budgets. Well, the record inflation is a direct result of these stimulus checks that went out in 2021. But now we're going to, quote, help people by sending them more and creating a greater problem for them. That does not help people. That just makes the prices go up even more. It says, as Go Banking Rates reported earlier this week, 13 states are currently offering stimulus money to constituents. And this goes on to detail some of those programs now. In all fairness, this is a little bit misleading of an article in saying that these stimulus payments are going out. Some of these are actually tax rebates due to states having a surplus of revenue, and they're refunding that to taxpayers. That's not the same as simply saying everybody gets a check, regardless. But in some cases, that is the case here, is everybody's getting a check. And when you do that, some people, especially the people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, they're going to spend that. As soon as they get it, they're going to go out and spend that. So you're going to increase demand when supply hasn't been increased correspondingly. You get higher prices. And this isn't just in these states. We see this article. This is from AFP. It says, again, you can't make these headlines up. Japan to spend $260 billion to tackle inflation in the weak yen. So they have a weak yen, their currency is weak, meaning the purchasing power has been declining. So to solve that, they're going to print more, and that'll tackle the problem, right? Yeah, no. It says Japan will spend $260 billion on a stimulus package to cushion the economy from the impact of inflation and the weak yen, Prime Minister Kishida announced on Friday. But the central bank is refusing to budge from the ultra-loose policy that has hammered Japanese currency this year, wiping out more than 20% of its value against the dollar. Now keep in mind, that's the purchasing power of the yen versus the dollar. The dollar has also been losing its purchasing power. So the yen's lost way more than 20% of its purchasing power. That's just relative to the dollar. And so their solution is, let's print more, right? You're not going to get a different result, guys. It says the government hopes the 39 trillion yen in physical spending will rise to 72 trillion when private sector investments are taken into account. It says, we want to protect people's livelihoods, employment, and businesses while strengthening our economy for the future, he told reporters, adding the move should help push up GDP by 4.6%. Well, yeah, in inflated terms. So if inflation's 20%, GDP is up 4.6%, you're actually down 15.4%. That's but you can have this headline that says, look, the economy grew. Prices are rising in Japan at their fastest rate in 8 years, although the 3% inflation rate remains well below the sky-high levels seen in the United States and elsewhere. Well, keep in mind, they just said that the yen lost 20% of its value relative to the dollar, but the inflation rate's only 3%. What that's telling us is that their fake inflation rate, the government reported inflation lie of 3%, is well below the sky-high inflation lie government levels, statistic levels in the United States and other countries, because all these countries are lying. They're not telling the truth about inflation. A lot of them, their social programs are tied to their official inflation rate. So if they tell the truth about what that inflation rate is, their budgets will balloon correspondingly. So if inflation's 20%, they say it's 10, and then they increase people's social payments, say Social Security in the United States by 10%. They tell everybody, hey, you got a 10% raise. But in reality, the purchasing power declined. All the prices went up 20%. So you actually didn't get a raise. You got less. So, but this is the logic that's going through the minds of some of these politicians and central bankers. It says Japan, which has one of the world's highest debt to GDP ratios, has already injected hundreds of billions of dollars into its economy over the past 2 years to support recovery from the pandemic. Maybe that could be the reason you're seeing this inflation and you're having the yen decline massively to the dollar. It says Friday's package, funded by a special budget of $200 billion, will include measures to encourage wage growth and support households with energy bills, which has spiked since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So again, it has nothing to do with what they just said was massive spending over the course of the last 2 years. It has to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? So again, expect more of this. This is what we said would happen. Politicians can help themselves when people are in dire straits. And it's sad that we're seeing this, but the reason this inflation is there is because of these government policies. And then they're going to turn around and promise, well, we'll hand out currency. And we've talked in the past about governments they can't print food and energy and other goods and services. They just can't. All they can do is print currency. And we're seeing this not just in the United States and Japan, we're seeing it especially in the European Union, and it's only going to ratchet up. In the European Union, not only have you had rising food prices, but you've had massive increases in energy cost. In some cases, people have seen their household energy bills go up 10 to 20 fold in over a year to a level people just cannot pay. It's not a unwillingness to pay, they can't pay. And so they're turning to the government, households, businesses, everyone, and all these trade associations and saying, you've got to bail us out here or we're going to lose our home, we're going to lose our business, we're not going to be able to compete internationally. So what's the government solution going to be? Well, we'll subsidize that energy, meaning we'll print up currency and use that to pay for the energy. But what's that going to do? It's just going to make the price of the energy go up. And then, of course, then their next step would be to say, well, let's put price caps on the amount that could be paid for energy. That'll solve the problem. But of course, that'll just lead to shortages. There won't be any energy at all. So you can see the problem here. We're not going down a good road. This is happening globally because for the last 50 years, for the first time in human history, all the major currencies of the world are fiat currencies, meaning there's nothing backing them up except people's belief that those currencies have value. That's the only reason they have value. As soon as people lose that faith, the currency becomes worthless, and that's when you have hyperinflation. And we read this story right here. This is from MarketWatch. It's titled, Hedge Fund Giant Elliott Warns Looming Hyperinflation Could Lead to Global Societal Collapse. It starts off, it says, investors should not assume they have, quote, seen everything. That's executives at leading hedge fund firm Elliott Management Corporation warning that the world is heading toward the worst financial crisis since World War II. In a letter sent to investors and reportedly seen by the Financial Times, the Florida-headquartered firm told clients that it believes the global economy is in an extremely challenging situation that could lead to hyperinflation. Elliott did not respond to MarketWatch's request for comment. The firm, led by billionaire Paul Singer and Jonathan Pollock, told its clients that investors should not assume they have seen everything because they have been through the peaks and troughs of the 1987 crash, the dot-com boom and bust, the 2008 global financial crisis, and previous bear and bull markets. It added that the extraordinary period of cheap money, we'll call it currency, is coming to an end and has made possible a set of outcomes that would be at or beyond the boundaries of the entire post-World War II period. The letter reportedly said the world is on the path to hyperinflation, which could lead to global societal collapse and civil or international strife. Elliott reportedly argued that markets have not fallen enough yet, and that an equity market decline of more than 50% would be normal, adding that it couldn't predict when that would happen. The S&P 500 has dropped 19% from its peak at the beginning of the year. Elliott executives warned clients that the idea that we will not panic because we've seen this before does not comport with the current facts. They blamed central bank policymakers for the current global economic situation, saying they've been dishonest about the reasons for high inflation. It's what we've just been talking about. They said lawmakers had shirked responsibility by blaming it on supply chain disruption caused by the pandemic instead of citing the loose monetary policy imposed 2 years ago during the pandemic peak. That says it all right there. It is these policies that were put in place with near 0% interest rates, central banks going out and buying corporate debt, buying mortgage-backed securities, flooding the financial arena with currency, and then all of these fiscal programs to hand out stimulus checks and defer payment of your rent, your student loans, everything else. That put more currency in people's hands. There were fewer products and services because fewer people were working and areas of the economy were locked down. You lower supply and increase demand, you're going to get a higher price, and that's exactly what we've seen. Now, they're talking about hyperinflation here. Does that mean that all this is going to happen tomorrow or even next year? No, it does not. I think before we see that, and let me go back and look at this chart again. If we go back and look at this M1 chart, we've seen a lot of those programs we just talked about have ended, and now we're seeing this sort of come over the hill. I believe it's probably going to crash, and we're going to have a deflationary spiral similar to what we saw in the Great Depression, where companies lay off workers, the workers cut back on their spending, which causes other areas of the economy to experience issues where they lay off workers, and you have this implosion where firms can't meet their debt obligations, especially as the interest rates go up. So we're heading into, I believe, a depression. We've talked before about a depression in Europe based on the energy situation we've seen there and how that would cascade throughout the global financial system and lead to a global depression. I think that's the next step before we get to a hyperinflation, is this deflationary episode. Now, deflation means the money supply is contracting. It does not necessarily, unfortunately, mean that prices will go down. We'll see a decline in prices for things like automobiles, things that you don't necessarily need. You don't need to buy a new automobile, but you have to have food and you have to have fuel. And we've discussed some of the shortfalls there. So I would expect food and fuel prices to stay elevated, but prices for just about everything else to go down as we experience this deflationary spiral. However, I don't think, unlike the Great Depression, we're not going to have a 10-year deflationary period. It may be 6 to 18 months at most, and the political response from the central bankers and the politicians is going to be to do exactly what we saw them do before with the pandemic, but multiply that by 100 times over, right? We're going to see the institution of universal basic income, stimulus checks for groceries, stimulus checks for fuel. They're going to do everything they can. They're going to throw everything they can at this deflationary spiral to try to prevent this contraction. And when they do, that's when they will destroy the currency, and we will have this hyperinflationary meltdown. So what does all this have to do with Bible prophecy? Well, in Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 through 6, we read this. It says, "When the Lamb broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, 'Come.' I looked up and I saw a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice from among the four living beings say, 'A loaf of wheat bread or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay, and don't waste the olive oil and wine.'" So what does that mean? Well, it means that barely enough food to survive. You'll work all day just to make enough wages to buy the food that you need to barely survive that day. But olive oil and wine, which were luxuries at the time this was written, those luxuries won't be messed with. The wealthy will do just fine during this hyperinflationary period that the Bible says is coming. This is coming during the tribulation, so it will not occur until that time. And it's likely, it says this is coming after a war. So we're going to see a lot of other events. It's not going to be solely as a result of the things that we're talking about today, but we see the setup for this. And the fact that we see all these fiat currencies that have nothing backing them, no value, except that people believe they have value. And once that belief goes away, those currencies crash. And the rich will do just fine, because a currency crashing doesn't destroy hotels, farmland, factories, gold, silver, real things, but it does destroy stocks, bonds, the values of real estate. The dollar values of all those things will decline precipitously as this takes hold. And you may even see at the end of it, end of this hyperinflation, you're going to see things like the stock market go up 50-fold in 1 year. But that's really going to be a crash, even though it's heading up, because the purchasing power of the currency is going to go down at a much higher rate. So if a loaf of bread costs 200 times what it did at the beginning of the year, and the stock market's up 50-fold, well, you didn't make money in the stock market. You lost purchasing power in the stock market. So we're going to see a crash that really destroys the Western financial system, I believe, this current system that we're on. What is that going to lead to? What are people who are working an entire day's wages just to get enough food to survive? What are they going to want? Who are they going to turn to? Who is the politician they're going to turn to demand a change in their circumstances? Well, since this happens during the tribulation, we know that's the Antichrist. So this sets the stage for the rise of the Antichrist. We see a whole host of issues here where we need a new monetary system after an event like this. And we know central bank digital currencies are what they're pushing right now. So we're going to see the mark of the beast system in the tribulation come into being as the world's monetary system during the second half of the tribulation. So all of this, guys, sets the stage for, we're seeing the stage set for hyperinflation, which is an event during the tribulation, which sets the foundation and the stage for the Antichrist to rule. So we live in the season of the Lord's return, guys. No doubt about it. We're seeing all these signs converge, and Jesus said, when you see those signs converge, you can know his return is near. So have hope. Don't let this news bring you down. Jesus is coming back, and he's coming back soon. So let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. Make sure to like and share this. And God willing, I'll see you on Monday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.